Here are 50 most commonly asked interview questions related to SAP ABAP Adobe Forms, along with detailed answers for interviews. 1. What are SAP ABAP Adobe Forms, and how do they differ from traditional SAP script forms? Answer. SAP ABAP Adobe Forms are advanced form templates developed using Adobe Lifecycle Designer and integrated with SAP systems for printing and electronic distribution. Unlike traditional SAP script forms, Adobe Forms offer superior design capabilities, allowing for intricate layouts, graphics, and dynamic content. They also support interactive features such as user input fields and calculations, enhancing user experience and functionality. 2. Can you explain the architecture of SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer. The architecture of SAP ABAP Adobe Forms comprises three main components. A. Form interface defines the structure and parameters exchanged between the SAP system and the Adobe form. B. Form layout, created using Adobe Lifecycle Designer, determines the visual appearance and content of the form. C. Form processing handles data binding, event handling, and integration with SAP backend systems for data retrieval and processing. This architecture ensures seamless interaction between the form layout and the SAP system. 3. What are the advantages of using SAP ABAP Adobe Forms over traditional SAP script forms? Answer. The advantages of SAP ABAP Adobe Forms include: A. Enhanced design. Adobe Forms offer advanced design capabilities, allowing for intricate layouts, graphics, and dynamic content. B. Interactivity. Adobe Forms support interactive features such as user input fields, calculations, and validations, improving user engagement and functionality. C. Integration. Adobe Forms seamlessly integrate with SAP backend systems for data retrieval and processing, streamlining business processes. D. Cross-platform compatibility. Adobe Forms can be distributed electronically in PDF format, ensuring compatibility across different devices and platforms. 4. How do you create a new Adobe form in SAP ABAP? Answer. To create a new Adobe form in SAP ABAP, you can use transaction code SF Form Builder or ABAP function modules such as FP Create Form and FP Open Form. These tools provide a user-friendly interface for designing form templates and defining form logic, making it easy to create and customize Adobe Forms within the SAP environment. 5. What is the role of a data connection in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer. Data connection in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms establishes a link between the form layout and the SAP backend system for data retrieval and processing. It defines the data structure and parameters exchanged between the form and the SAP system, ensuring seamless integration and real-time data synchronization. 6. How do you bind data to form fields in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer. Data binding in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms involves linking form fields to corresponding data elements or structures defined in the SAP backend system. This is typically achieved using form context nodes and elements, which map to specific fields or tables in the SAP data model. By establishing this binding, the form can dynamically display and interact with data from the SAP system. 7. Can you explain the concept of master pages in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer. Master pages in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms are template layouts that define common elements shared across multiple pages of the form, such as headers, footers, and logos. By using master pages, designers can ensure consistency in the visual appearance and branding of the form, simplifying layout design and maintenance. 8. How do you handle events and scripting in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer. Events and scripting in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms allow for dynamic behavior and interactivity within the form. Events such as button clicks or field validations can trigger custom scripts written in JavaScript, which can perform actions such as data validation, calculations, or navigation. By leveraging events and scripting, developers can enhance the functionality and usability of Adobe Forms. 9. What are the different output formats supported by SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer. SAP ABAP Adobe Forms support various output formats, including print PDF, interactive PDF-based interactive forms, and email-attached PDF. The choice of output format depends on the application context and distribution requirements. For example, print forms are suitable for generating hard copies, while interactive forms enable user input and interaction within the PDF viewer. 10. How do you handle translations and multilingual support in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer. Translations and multilingual support in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms involve creating separate language versions of the form layout and providing translations for text elements and labels. This can be achieved using language-specific text elements or translation tables within the SAP system, ensuring that users can access the form in their preferred language. 11. What is the role of form logic in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer. Form logic in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms encompasses scripting and calculations performed within the form layout to control behavior and appearance based on user interactions or data values. This includes handling events, performing validations, and executing custom business logic to enhance the form's interactivity and dynamic capabilities. 12. How do you integrate SAP ABAP Adobe Forms with backend SAP systems for data retrieval and processing? Answer. Migration with backend SAP systems in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms is achieved using ABAP function modules or web services for data retrieval and processing. Data connections defined in the form interface establish communication between the form layout and the SAP backend, enabling real-time access to SAP data and services. 13. Can you explain the concept of fragment design in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer. Fragment design in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms involves modularizing form layout elements into reusable fragments that can be shared across multiple forms or form templates. By encapsulating common layout components such as headers, footers, or logos into fragments, designers can promote consistency and reusability in form design, simplifying maintenance and updates. 14. What are interactive forms by Adobe IFBA, and how do they differ from traditional Adobe forms? Answer. Interactive forms by Adobe IFBA are PDF-based forms developed using Adobe Lifecycle Designer and integrated with SAP systems. Unlike traditional Adobe forms, IFBA forms offer enhanced interactivity features such as user input fields, calculations, and validations, allowing users to interact with the form directly within the PDF viewer. IFBA forms are typically used for scenarios requiring user input and data collection, such as surveys or data entry forms. 15. How do you handle security and authorization in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer. Security and authorization in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms involve implementing access controls and user permissions at various levels, including form design, data access, and form processing. This includes defining role-based access controls, encrypting sensitive data, and implementing authentication mechanisms to ensure that only authorized users can access and interact with the form data. Additionally, digital signatures can be used to verify the authenticity and integrity of the form contents, providing an extra layer of security. 16. How do you design a complex layout in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer. Designing a complex layout in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms involves utilizing the layout editor in Adobe Lifecycle Designer to arrange and format form elements such as tables, graphics, and text fields. By leveraging the design tools and alignment guides, designers can create visually appealing and functional form layouts that meet business requirements. 17. Can you explain the role of form templates in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms development? Answer. Form templates in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms serve as reusable design templates that define the overall structure and styling of the form. They encapsulate common layout elements and formatting settings, allowing designers to quickly create new forms with consistent branding and layout. 18. How do you handle complex calculations and formulas in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer: handling complex calculations and formulas in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms involves using scripting languages such as JavaScript to perform mathematical operations, conditional logic, and data manipulations. By writing custom scripts, developers can implement dynamic calculations and validations based on user input and form data. 19. What are floating fields in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms, and how are they used? Answer: floating fields in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms are form elements that can be dynamically positioned within the form layout based on runtime conditions. They are typically used for displaying variable length content or accommodating dynamic data, such as variable length text or tabular data. 20. How do you handle conditional formatting in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer: conditional formatting in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms allows designers to apply different styles or properties to form elements based on runtime conditions. This can be achieved using scripting languages such as JavaScript to evaluate conditions and dynamically adjust formatting settings such as font color, background color, or visibility. 21. What is the purpose of form fragments in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer: form fragments in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms are reusable components that encapsulate common layout elements or functionality, such as headers, footers, or form sections. They promote modularization and reusability in form design, enabling designers to easily reuse and maintain common design components across multiple forms. 22. How do you handle dynamic data binding in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer: dynamic data binding in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms involves linking form elements to dynamic data sources or variables that are determined at runtime. This can be achieved using scripting languages such as JavaScript to dynamically populate form fields or tables based on user input or backend data retrieval. 23. What are the different types of form objects available in Adobe Lifecycle Designer? Answer: Adobe Lifecycle Designer provides various types of form objects, including text fields, checkboxes, radio buttons, drop-down lists, buttons, and tables. These form objects can be used to create interactive form elements for capturing user input, displaying data, or triggering actions. 24. How do you validate user input in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer: validating user input in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms involves implementing client-side and server-side validation mechanisms to ensure data integrity and accuracy. Client-side validation can be performed using JavaScript to validate input fields before form submission, while server-side validation can be performed in ABAP after data submission to enforce business rules and data consistency. 25. What is the purpose of global data elements in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer: global data elements in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms are predefined data elements that are shared across multiple form objects or form fragments within the form template. They allow designers to maintain consistency and synchronization of data values across different parts of the form layout. 26. How do you handle page breaks and pagination in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer: handling page breaks and pagination in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms involves defining page templates and layout settings to control the appearance and behavior of page breaks. Designers can specify conditions for automatic page breaks, adjust page margins and spacing, and implement custom page templates for different sections of the form. 27. Can you explain the role of interactive form parameters in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer: interactive form parameters in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms Define parameters and settings for controlling the behavior and appearance of interactive form elements. They allow designers to customize features such as form submission, data binding, and event handling to meet specific requirements. 28. How do you integrate digital signatures into SAP ABAP Adobe Forms for document authentication? Answer: integrating digital signatures into SAP ABAP Adobe Forms involves configuring form objects and settings to support digital signature fields and authentication mechanisms. This includes defining signature fields, configuring signature properties, and implementing digital certificate validation to ensure document authenticity and integrity. 29. What are the different deployment options for SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer: SAP ABAP Adobe Forms can be deployed in various ways, including A. Printing. Forms can be printed directly from the SAP system using standard print programs and output devices. B. Email. Forms can be attached to email messages and distributed electronically to recipients. C. Web. Forms can be published to web portals or applications for online viewing and interaction. D. Archive. Forms can be stored in document repositories or archives for record keeping and retrieval purposes. 30. How do you handle dynamic text and language translations in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer: handling dynamic text and language translations in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms involves using language-specific text elements or translation tables to provide translations for form labels, messages, and instructions. Designers can define language-specific versions of the form layout and text elements, allowing users to access the form in their preferred language. 31. What are interactive forms by Adobe IFBA, and how do they differ from traditional Adobe forms? Answer: interactive forms by Adobe IFBA are PDF-based forms developed using Adobe Lifecycle Designer and integrated with SAP systems. Unlike traditional Adobe forms, IFBA forms offer enhanced interactivity features such as user input fields, calculations, and validations, allowing users to interact with the form directly within the PDF viewer. IFBA forms are typically used for scenarios requiring user input and data collection, such as surveys or data entry forms. 32. How do you handle security and authorization in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer: security and authorization in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms involve implementing access controls and user permissions at various levels, including form design, data access, and form processing. This includes defining role-based access controls, encrypting sensitive data, and implementing authentication mechanisms to ensure that only authorized users can access and interact with the form data. Additionally, digital signatures can be used to verify the authenticity and integrity of the form contents, providing an extra layer of security. 33. How do you handle conditional formatting in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer: conditional formatting in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms allows designers to apply different styles or properties to form elements based on runtime conditions. This can be achieved using scripting languages such as JavaScript to evaluate conditions and dynamically adjust formatting settings such as font color, background color, or visibility. 34. What is the role of form fragments in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer: form fragments in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms are reusable components that encapsulate common layout elements or functionality, such as headers, footers, or form sections. They promote modularization and reusability in form design, enabling designers to easily reuse and maintain common design components across multiple forms. 35. How do you handle dynamic data binding in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer: dynamic data binding in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms involves linking form elements to dynamic data sources or variables that are determined at runtime. This can be achieved using scripting languages such as JavaScript, To dynamically populate form fields or tables based on user input or backend data retrieval. 36. How do you handle form layout adjustments for different output devices in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer. Form layout adjustments for different output devices in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms involve using responsive design techniques to adapt the form layout dynamically based on the device type and screen size. This can include adjusting font sizes, element spacing, and column widths to ensure optimal rendering on various devices such as desktops, tablets, and smartphones. 37. What are the key considerations for optimizing form performance in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer. Key considerations for optimizing form performance in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms include minimizing the use of complex scripts and calculations, reducing the number of form objects and graphics, optimizing data retrieval and processing logic, and implementing caching mechanisms for frequently accessed data. Additionally, optimizing form layout and design can improve rendering speed and responsiveness. 38. How do you handle large volumes of data in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer. Handling large volumes of data in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms involves implementing efficient data retrieval and processing techniques to minimize performance overhead. This can include using server-side pagination for large datasets, optimizing database queries, and implementing lazy loading mechanisms to fetch data dynamically as needed. 39. Can you explain the role of form variables in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer. Form variables in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms are placeholders for storing and manipulating data within the form template. They can be used to store intermediate calculation results, user input values, or dynamic data retrieved from backend systems. Form variables enable dynamic behavior and data manipulation within the form layout. 40. How do you handle form submission and data processing in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer. Handling form submission and data processing in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms involves defining event handlers and processing logic to handle form submission events. This can include validating user input, performing data transformations, and updating backend systems with the submitted data. By implementing robust form processing logic, developers can ensure data integrity and consistency. 41. What are the best practices for designing accessible SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer. Best practices for designing accessible SAP ABAP Adobe Forms include A. Using descriptive labels and instructions for form elements. B. Providing keyboard navigation support and focus indicators. C. Ensuring adequate color contrast for text and background elements. D. Using semantic markup and ARIA attributes for screen reader compatibility. E. Testing forms with assistive technologies to verify accessibility compliance. 42. How do you handle form versioning and template management in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer. Form versioning and template management in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms involve maintaining a centralized repository of form templates and versions, with proper version control and documentation. This ensures that users have access to the latest form templates and can track changes and updates over time. Additionally, implementing a formal approval process for form modifications helps maintain consistency and quality. 43. Can you explain the role of digital signatures in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms for document authentication and approval? Answer. Digital signatures in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms provide a secure mechanism for authenticating and approving electronic documents. They use cryptographic techniques to generate and verify digital signatures, ensuring document integrity and non-repudiation. Digital signatures can be used for various purposes, including document approval, contract signing, and compliance with regulatory requirements. 44. How do you handle user authentication and authorization in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer. User authentication and authorization in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms involve integrating with SAP user management and authentication mechanisms to validate user identities and enforce access controls. This can include implementing single sign-on SSO solutions, role-based access controls RBAC, and user group permissions to restrict access to sensitive form data and functionalities. 45. What are the different deployment options for SAP ABAP Adobe Forms and SAP systems? Answer. SAP ABAP Adobe Forms can be deployed in various ways within SAP systems, including A. Printing. Forms can be printed directly from the SAP system using standard print programs and output devices. B. Email. Forms can be attached to email messages and distributed electronically to recipients. C. Web. Forms can be published to web portals or applications for online viewing and interaction. D. Archive. Forms can be stored in document repositories or archives for record keeping and retrieval purposes. 46. How do you ensure form layout consistency and branding across multiple forms in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms projects? Answer. Ensuring form layout consistency and branding across multiple forms in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms projects involves establishing design standards and guidelines for form templates, including layout, styling, and branding elements. Designers can create reusable form templates with consistent design elements, such as headers, footers, and logos, and enforce adherence to these standards through regular reviews and approvals. 47. What are the considerations for designing mobile-friendly SAP ABAP Adobe Forms? Answer. Designing mobile-friendly SAP ABAP Adobe Forms requires optimizing form layout and interaction for smaller screens and touch-based input. This includes using responsive design techniques to adapt the form layout dynamically based on the device type and screen size, optimizing form elements for touch interactions, and minimizing unnecessary scrolling and zooming. Testing forms on different mobile devices and platforms helps ensure compatibility and usability. 48. How do you handle data encryption and protection in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms for sensitive information? Answer. Handling data encryption and protection in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms involves implementing encryption algorithms and data security measures to safeguard sensitive information. This can include encrypting form data during transmission and storage, implementing access controls to restrict data access, and auditing user activities for compliance with data privacy regulations. 49. What are the key performance indicators (KPIs) for evaluating SAP ABAP Adobe Forms performance? Answer. Key performance indicators (KPIs) for evaluating SAP ABAP Adobe Forms performance include A. Form rendering time. The time taken to render the form layout and display it to the user. B. Form submission time. The time taken to submit the form data and process it on the server. C. Data retrieval time. The time taken to retrieve data from backend systems or external sources. D. Server resource utilization. The CPU, memory, and network resources consumed by form processing activities. E. User experience metrics. User satisfaction, usability, and accessibility metrics gathered through user feedback and testing. 50. How do you handle form localization and language support in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms for global deployments? Answer. Handling form localization and language support in SAP ABAP Adobe Forms involves providing translations for form labels, messages, and instructions in multiple languages to accommodate users from different regions and language preferences. This can be achieved using language-specific text elements or translation tables within the SAP system, allowing users to access the form in their preferred language. Additionally, implementing language detection and fallback mechanisms ensures a seamless user experience for global deployments. The above 50 questions and answers cover various aspects of SAP ABAP Adobe Forms. including design principles, development techniques, integration methods, security considerations, performance optimization, and deployment strategies. They provide comprehensive insights into creating interactive and dynamic forms within SAP systems, ensuring candidates are well equipped to handle form design, development, and deployment challenges effectively. For more exciting tips, tricks, and more importantly, for valuable insights of interviews, please share, like, and subscribe to my channel. It has a lot of valuable information about various insights of interviews. It has a wide range of real-world portfolio projects of various technologies for interviews, and it has wide range of most asked interview questions and answers of various technologies like data science, SAP, AWS, DevOps, and full-stack web development, and more. That will be useful during interviews. It has a wide range of most asked interview questions and answers and real-world portfolio projects of various technologies for freshers, for 2 to 3 years, experienced candidates, and for 5 or above years, experienced candidates to test their skills by knowing most asked interview questions and make themselves ready for interviews.